I said to him, does that make any sense in a country deeply concerned about the declining fortunes of the white working class? If in fact the white working class, who have always benefited both by material advantages and their own psychological benefits of whiteness, are struggling to imagine that their children will do better than they have done in this society, why is it that a black elite person would be telling you, a white elite person, that what ails young black people in America is that they don't work hard enough? So, rereading the mid-century debate about which strategy, a socialist turn uniting black and red in a popular front of labor-led radicalism versus a reformist integrationist approach, would lead to the end of racial terror and redlining, which seemed to reproduce the same leadership impasse we find ourselves in today. Revisiting debates with Du Bois at center stage, flanked by Ralph Bunche and Howard University's Young Turks on one side and the elder statesman Walter White of the NAACP and National Urban League leadership on the other, feels like the argument that black voters, generationally divided today, are having about Bernie versus Biden, or some rough approximation thereof. And to be clear, this historiography is as rich, nuanced, and important on its own terms as it was when first published. But there's one huge difference between then and now. We've seen the full arc of integrationist, reformist approaches play out. Obama's election, followed by Trump, isn't just another version of Reconstruction followed by a nadir. This is a fundamental break with the past, where any aspirational claims to holding out hope for racial justice by white moral proxy, as Gunnar Myrdal insisted, are tempered by a 50-year record of widening disparities within and outside and between black America. Educational and housing segregation, criminal justice, health and wealth gaps are over-indexed in the collective public conscience. And therefore, the continuation of the kind of water is wet research that we keep doing, seems to me, is not going to solve this problem. We have a much better sense that racism has political and economic value. It wins elections, sets markets rates, and sells products from homes to clothing. Like money, race is an abstraction. It is a form of currency that we collectively agree assigns value to something tangible, like who should live where, in what neighborhood, or go to what school, or run this company, or museum, or college, or university, or whatever. And so I draw on the work of Nikhil Singh, as well as most recently Keeanga Yamata's work, where she notes, quote, the reality of a racialized political economy challenged the idea that inclusion in the financial and public services that for so long had excluded African Americans was enough to overcome the physical and economic devastation of black urban communities. Indeed, I have argued, she notes, that inclusion in those processes laid the basis for even greater exploitative and predatory practices, or what she calls predatory inclusion, in transactions involving the urban housing market. Remember what Whitson said about black real estate agents? Housing value in the United States continued to be scaled according to the proximity of African Americans, she writes in her newest book, Race for Profit. The turn to inclusion was only allowable by maintaining other forms of inclusion. Credit inclusion became possible by holding the line of neighborhood exclusion. The value of that asset will be weighed by the race or ethnicity of whoever possesses it. Keeanga's notion of predatory inclusion is an indispensable analytical framework for taking seriously the limits of how leadership was defined for the past 2 generations. In Skip's essay, The Parable of Talents, he wrote, quote, for the first time, we have a different presence of black agents, black editors, black reviewers. Blacks now run and own record labels. They produce films, black concerts. The old black talent, white management pattern has finally started to break down. With the active recruitment of minorities into the mainstream, blacks have an institutional authority without precedent in American cultural history. And as we know, if Skip were here today, and certainly if he were to participate in Q&A, would remind us, as he often does, at the meteoric growth of the black middle class and how we have to take seriously their presence. It would have been hard, however, to not have a measure of optimism, as Skip did, for such possibilities in 1996 when he co-authored The Future of the Race with the good brother Dr. Cornel West. Or should I say, Brother Cornell. And yet the problem of board members and leadership at the top was so much a crisis a few years ago that even I was catapulted dizzyingly to the board of the Museum of Modern Art. Which, in saying this, is my point, that this is the kind of cosmetic work where we scramble to reposition black people rather than to take seriously the institutional requirements of transformation. In the same book, As Future of the Race, Cornell offers a different view, channeling Du Bois's 1948 revision of The Talented Tenth. And here he quotes Du Bois. When I came out of college into the world of work when Du Bois came out, I realized that it was quite possible that my plan of training a talented tenth might put in control and power a group of selfish, self-indulgent, well-to-do men whose basic interest in solving the Negro problem was personal freedom and unhampered enjoyment and use of the world without any real care or certainty, or certainly no arousing care as to what became of the mass of American Negroes or of the mass of any people. My talented tenth, I could see, might result in a sort of interracial free-for-all, with the devil taking the hindmost and the foremost taking anything they could lay their hands on. West's perspective was quite distinct from Skip's. Quote, they must not be too frank, he noted, and outspoken, and must never fail to flatter and to be pleasant in order to lessen white unease, these black elites of the 1990s. Of white unease and discomfort, things we might refer to today as white innocence and white fragility. Needless to say, this is not the raw stuff, Cornell continued, for healthy relations between black and white people. Yet this suppression of black rage, the reducing, the boiling to a simmer, backfires in the end. It reinforces a black obsession with the psychic scars, ontological wounds, and existential bruises that tend to reduce the tragic to the pathetic. Instead of exercising agency, let me repeat, instead of exercising agency or engaging in action against the odds, one may wallow in self-pity, acknowledging the sheer absurdity of it all. And the historical observation is this: neither Skip nor Cornell could know for sure what was to come. But we now know where we sit. In light of Obama's 2 terms and the Trump backlash, the question is, does this moment require a leadership perspective that has not yet been the dominant one? A road to travel that few black elites have ventured down. What to do different in the age of Trump and beyond is not an empirical question, but defining a pattern of racial leadership predicated on core assumptions about what would happen when black people gained leadership positions after the fall of legal segregation should in fact be reinterrogated. And if this question is already being answered by other folks, I'm happy to know of their work. This is new for me. Thank you very much. I welcome your questions at this time.
I just want to say that Skip is watching online, and, and thanks you for a great job, and for the shout out to him, to Cornell, to Tommy, and to Brendan.
Thank you so much, Professor Muhammad. I really love your work. My question is just about this, your thesis. So you talk about curriculum, but my thing is, I want to ask about, and what role do you think just practices plays in these spaces in cultivating what you might call a black elite? And this is what I mean. So I went to Morehouse College. In terms of information, critical conscious information, that was totally available, and the students could get up and put on their suits and talk about black history as fruitful as anybody. But then as soon as they step off the podium, they go in, they're about to go interview for J.P. Morgan, things like that. So my thing is like, how we, in terms of like the information gap, of course it seems to be true, but as soon as I leave Cornell's course and receive the information, if I'm a white student or a black student, I'm still immediately going back into the social space of practices and whiteness and things like that. And that seems like that's doing more work in the cultivation of black elite than even in the classroom lacking information.
Yeah, I think you're restating the dilemma. So to restate your question, if I have posited, as Woodson himself posited, that miseducation is a core problem, meaning people don't know their history, aren't fortified with the knowledge of how to assess the system as it is, that they might find themselves either complicit in it or active agents in oppressing others. That would be what's in. So you're saying even when people have been exposed to this information, they may willingly opt out of the kind of system change. And that to me is the both-and proposition. We must first address what we might call a core problem of the miseducation as a structural problem. That is that most people aren't at Morehouse, and increasingly fewer and fewer are. So even in a segregated context, which is the irony of HBCUs, we're educating black folks to function mostly within a segregated economy. Now, that desegregation means that a lot more black folks are not even going to places like Morehouse to get the kind of education that you described. It's not an accident that Howard University has produced some of the most incredible anti-racist black feminist scholars in this country. So it's not to say the curriculum, it may be insufficient, but it is indispensable. On the second part of the question, partly what I'm trying to split the difference here is to suggest that rather than beating up black elites over the last 50 years for either their own false consciousness or for their own avarice, I'm suggesting that if we give them the benefit of the doubt of having made the best choices, your individual self in this elite environment of power, and figuring that you only have limited levers to pull. Maybe you are the first person to establish Black History Month celebration or Diversity Day on the job, or to get that affinity group going. Or maybe you raise a difficult question in a boardroom about whether or not we should raise the rates on homeowner lending in black communities. That kind of work is insufficient in hindsight. Right? I'm a historian, so part of my job is to figure out to the extent to which those choices made the kind of impact that people self-consciously thought would make the impact. So finally, to say, to your problem, we have to be more aggressive. Otherwise, we're only going to find ourselves making similar constrained choices and expecting a different outcome. Yes?
I was just going to, I mean, at the end of the day, doesn't it come down to, I'm thinking about populations. I'm thinking about the data of populations and the fact that, you know, Black Americans in particular, those who descend from chattel slavery, make up 14% of the population, right? And white Americans make up 70% of the population and make up and own most 90+% of the resources. So at the end of the day, doesn't it come down to, even if all the Black elites sort of fortify, it's almost like, I'm just going to say this flat-footed, it's almost like Negroes with guns, right? Like, even if you have 14% of the population armed with the knowledge, with all of it, and then in the institution and being aggressively challenging, you still have a 70% white population that the majority of which are kind of battling against that. So it's about numbers and also about basically a police state, which we have right here.
Yeah. So I tried to, I appreciate the question. It's a good question. So I tried to address this in my opening remarks with regard to the role that African Americans have played going back to the Constitutional Convention as the cipher for which competing notions of an America turned through white imaginations and fantasies. And so through us, white people projected their own sense of humanity. In which case, what is denied in that 14% demographic reality is the extraordinary multiplier effect of blackness as the linchpin of the American project. I didn't talk about Nikhil Singh's work, but Nikhil essentially says that republicanism and liberalism are defined by blackness. Without it, the whole thing falls apart. And if you accept that theoretical argument, then you could accept that we actually are the vehicle through which white elites have justified the kind of maldistribution of power and resources that they contain. And that without a black elite, we could use colonial intermediaries as a way of thinking about them, playing a role. It would have left to white Americas to work out for themselves which version of America was going to actually win, a left or a right, a pluralistic open society or a fascist closed one. So the degree to which we have functioned in that formulation as the glue that holds all of this madness together seems to me that we do have a lot more power that is far beyond our demographic representation.
Hi, Professor Mohammed.
Where's the mic? Yes.
Have you thought about the extent to which the salience of prosperity gospel in the black church plays a role in this miseducation at all?
I'm so glad you asked because, consider it Exhibit B. I have not thought through it enough for this paper, this part of the presentation, but I'm basically just saying thank you for reminding me how important it is. One of the things, just to lift up Woodson very quickly, in some ways, black ministers were the whipping boys of his analysis. He was deeply, deeply disappointed in the role that what he called miseducated Negro ministers played in upholding segregation as a status quo, not only for their own miseducation, but as a consequence of it, as he would term, but also because they gained by playing along, by playing by the rules of segregation. And so, we've got Darrell Scott in Cleveland handing out $300 checks to black folks at a Trump rally. So there's a lot to be said for that echo. But I'm just going to say thank you very much for bringing it up. It's important to add to the story. Yes.
Thank you so much for this very thought-provoking talk. Book recommendation, Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership by Erica Edwards.
Excellent.
It synthesizes a black feminist critique of patriarchal black leadership, elite bourgeois black leadership. Just
Thank you.
a book recommendation. I grew up in Jack and Jill. And at the risk of sounding somewhat defensive, I want to offer some reflections that you sort of anticipated in your talk on your terminology and your method. In terms of your terminology, it seems to me like you're more interested in ideology than in a class of people, and that's what you said. But I bring that up to say, it seems to me like there are, I know for a fact that there are black elites who are radicalized in elite institutions like Harvard, right? There's a general education course taught here on black radicalism, right? And that seems to me a part of the professionalization of a black leadership class that could, in effect, find itself engaging in radical black activism. So what do I have in mind? I have in mind, as Robin D.G. Kelly points out in Hammer and Hoe, the fact that there were black middle-class people donating funds to the International Legal Defense Fund that was defending the Scottsboro Boys, right? I have in mind black elites who are financially supporting incarcerated family members while also fighting mass incarceration. Like, where is their education? Where is their radicalization occurring? And I would offer that it might not be happening at professional schools, right? But it might be happening in liberal arts educations, right? It might be happening in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Full disclosure, I took a oral exam field in Black Radical Thought with Professor West, right? My critique of racial capitalism is informed by the education that I received. And so I wonder if methodologically it might be useful to not just think exclusively about professional schools, but to think more broadly about liberal arts education and graduate schools, which are also training black elites for leadership positions.
Yeah. So I like this question because it's pushing back against at least how I frame the argument. And so that, I want to get this right because Fraser was not very well liked, nor Woodson. Right, Brother West? Yeah, and you haven't done so well in the age of Obama either. So, as love, you know what I mean. So part of what I'm doing is staking a claim to a part of the story that is sort of getting it out there. And so that kind of nuance is, I think, what you're partly telling me is I have to acknowledge that evidence. What I want to say is that all of the resistance, the anti-racist resistance, the progressive resistance, the left part of the Democratic Party, the Philip Agnews and Nina Turners of the Bernie campaign, to some degree are all legacies of Black studies in the big tent sense of things. The relationship of whether it's community-based learning or college-based learning, the work that Barbara Ransby and Kathy Cohen have been doing in Chicago with So it's not that that infrastructure isn't there, but partly what I'm saying is that infrastructure gets incredibly anemic at the highest levels of decision-making in this society. And so it works, it's magic from the outside in, and magic, it does work. I'm not diminishing that, and if I were to diminish it, it would be diminishing the power of the Black Power movement or Black freedom struggles more generally, which of course I'm not arguing in any way, shape, or form. But in trying to feel out the limits, what didn't work over the last 50 years, it seems to me, and I'm going to say this word partly because it's in my head, maybe it's provocative, I don't mean it in that way, but I don't want to be part of fetishizing all of our progressive power. So I want to move us from recognizing that if outside in and inside out has always been essentially the balance that moves political change and transformation, then it seems to me that the work we need to do is on the inside. That's where we've fallen short. And without, again, going down the black hole of adjudicating Obama's presidency, I'm happy to do that, but the most generous way I can put it is to say that it wasn't enough. Why it wasn't enough? I'm not going to be writing that book. But it wasn't enough. And so if the question is what then is required in a context where that kind of incredible symbolic power is necessary, a symbolic power that essentially absorbed the rays of blackness coming from Black Lives Matter and from Black progressive organizing, from I Too Am Harvard, from whatever pocket of anti-racist activism that a liberal arts program produced, it seems to me that that's what we want to disrupt. It's a both and. Yeah.
I was curious. It seems like the thrust of your coming research is going to be on curricula. Is that correct?
That's just part of it. I mentioned that as an important empirical question I'd like to answer.
Well, it's curious because it seems to me that you're focusing perhaps on something that's a weak straw in the sense that curriculum itself is driven by the priorities of those who want to employ the graduates of that curriculum. Just by way of analogy, colonial education is pretty instructive in this regard. For years, there were debates about what should be taught in African colonial circumstances, and the French spent a lot of time trying to reform the educational system in West Africa, and it had absolutely no effect in terms of curricular change because people were employed once they got through the educational system on whether or not they spoke French correctly, right? So all of the nuancing of the African history, the African local circumstance and the like was tolerated by the students who had to learn it. But they then performed in reference to what was employing them on the other side of the diploma. And this strikes me as, in a broad, general way, as probably true with a lot of professional education in the United States. It's not so much what is included in the curriculum as what's rewarded in the job market.
I want to leave space for learning what you just described in the colonial period so we can follow up. I want to if I heard you correctly, offer a response that would say the reason why I use the Kennedy School example of stop and frisk is to say that the Kennedy School is actually trains criminal justice policymakers to do a certain kind of work. It's going to happen one way or the other. And so it's not being divorced from the question of a kind of cultural product of African history, pre-colonial, to learning French to be a bureaucrat. That's certainly part of the landscape. My goal here is not to suggest that cancer researchers being trained here in the medical school are going to be better cancer researchers per se because they get more grounding in Black history. What I am saying is that in key aspects of professional school training, as in the example of public health or medical schools, where the question of the social determinants of health, the fact that this is brand new research, or research that remains still at the margins of the core of these very schools on our campus suggests to me that people are actually dying, because they're miseducated. And so that is about thinking more carefully about the way that in 2020, in a population that will be browner one way or the other. I mean, Black folks may not grow in significance, but most certainly non-Europeans will. This is life and death work, is kind of the point that I'm making. Yes?
No, I just want to thank you, though, my dear brother. This is so rich and so courageous, the work that you're doing. I can't wait till that second book comes out. I mean, my voice is gone from New Hampshire, you know. But I mean, your first book is the best book on white supremacy in the last 50 years, brother.
Thank you.
And the second one, we can't wait. But I just wonder, though, whether miseducation is getting at all of the different dimensions that you want. I think every bourgeoisie, no matter what color, tends to have dominant tendencies of cowardliness, conformity, and complacency. And education doesn't cut deep enough to deal with cowardliness. It doesn't dig enough to deal with complacency. You see what I mean? When I'm sitting here looking at Brother Preston Williams, what went into the formation of this brother in terms of lifting as he climbs? We have to be able to tell a story about the moral and spiritual formation of the Black bourgeoisie. So how is it that indifference sets in, that they don't want to lift as they climb? They don't really care about a young student coming in 1978 Cornell West, and he gonna keep track of me every week. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Something went into the morals and spiritual formation of him as a Harvard professor. Whereas every other Harvard professor, Black or whatever, might not have that. And so there has to be something about, yes, the education, but it's a question of formation of will and the soul craft of it. And what happens when the money takes over? What happens when commodification and incorporation takes over? So that even come out of Jack and Jill, I can understand Brother Will, because my mother tried to get me in because she loved me, but they were trying to tame me and it didn't work, you know. But that's all right. I understand her love. She's trying to expose me to things from the ghetto, because we didn't ice skate in the ghetto, and they did. and I wanted to be exposed to stuff like that. They took you to museums. I wanted to go to museums. And we playing basketball all day. So I got access to that, and that was a love from her, but it had to do with my spiritual and moral formation. So that you've hit something so crucial. I think Frazier was hitting it too, but he was not. He didn't linger with it the way you linger with it, and you had a different level at this point in you. So that what would you say about that spiritual moral formation of our Black middle class, that we fall so quickly to the indifference toward folk on the block? We're just scared. We're fearful. We can't wait to fit in with careers and opportunities grabbing. You remember what James Baldwin said about Lorraine Hansberry? She never confused keeping the faith with making it. Mm-hmm. See, that's your tradition. Yeah. That's my tradition. You see what I mean? That's Preston's tradition. And even Skip himself, giving my critiques of that brother, that he's somebody who's concerned about black folk making sure they have a presence. The subject matter has a presence. Within his liberal framework, that's his conception of keeping faith. And in that sense, he's been quite marvelous. And we have other kind of criticisms of the brother, and he got criticisms of us. But it's that sense of service, something bigger than just your own individual career, connected to a community, a tradition, a history, a heritage of people who've been catching hell.
Yeah, thank you, Cornell. I mean, it's still this question of faith and moral courage. I have to admit, I don't have an easy answer for where to find it in the 21st century. I mean, well, but the point being, we know the data on declining membership in churches. We've already had a conversation about the prosperity gospel. And we know the political weaponization of sort of black ethical traditions vis-a-vis the religious church, going back to George Bush, and are still playing out in the context of the Trump era. So I don't know what mode of disruption that is not organic to your home, your neighborhood, your faith tradition, or your community. I don't know what mode of disruption exists outside of some kind of education, whether it is political education in the Highlander folk school sense or the Ella Baker school sense of it, or in some form of traditional public school education setting, whether it's the Afrocentric charter school movement up through HBCUs, et cetera. I mean, it seems to me that's the battleground for the social policy work that we can engage in a collective project that is not predicated on what my mama, my daddy, my neighbor, my preacher told me. Because while your job is to train theologically future ministers to make that case, that is also an educational project. So I don't want to say I'm cynical, but it seems like the forces arrayed against the kind of moral and spiritual courage that you are describing have only grown over the past 50 years. And so I'm trying to figure out what are the modes of disruption that we can actually gain access to or mobilize, since we already have access but may not be doing enough. But it's a great dilemma.
Thank you, Professor Muhammad. I'm back here.
Yes.
I feel like I grew up in a tradition of going to Wednesday night prayer meetings, and I feel like I was in a Wednesday night prayer meeting with your lecture. Thank you. I just wanted to say Galatians 6:9, and let us not grow weary in doing good, because we shall reap if we faint not. So I just wanted to put that out there because I know it is complicated and depressing and distressing, and people are dying from all class positions, whether they're elite or the most impoverished, because it's weary, it's tiring. It's tiring to even talk about this. Why can't we talk about something else? Why we got to have you up here talking about this hard truth?
Right.
We would love to hear another aspect of your psychology and your wisdom, but we're thankful for this. I just want to say that. But I guess my question is really, I'm interested in, because you're talking very black and white, and we understand now, especially in this country, it's so much more complicated. Not only are black people reproducing white supremacy, Asian people are reproducing white supremacy. What about the indigenous population and all of these? I'm just wondering, it would really help if you can kind of trouble the waters around race, so that we're also seeing how white supremacy and capitalism which is what I understood what you were saying, these kind of systems, whoever buys into them and perpetuates, that's how the oppression continues. I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts about diversifying the.
One example that I'm very fond of teaching, because it's such a rich way to teach students who don't think about, say, Chinese Americans through the prism of model minority myths. There's a precise genealogy going from a degraded class of human beings as immigrants going back to the late 19th century that brought with it some of our first border closings, as well as deportation or definitions of criminal illegal aliens that was applied to Chinese immigrants, to a population by the late 30s, 40s into the 50s had been made over into a community of hardworking immigrants who were not like black people, whose identity was divorced from an affirmative recognition of their very old Asian identity to something that served a white power structure's definition of these not like black people prove that racism is not a problem in America. And most of my understanding of that history comes from the work of a colleague named Ellen Wu, who wrote a book called The Color of Success, and it's brilliant. And she looks at Japanese Americans and Southeast Asian or South Asian immigrants as well. So I won't extend the point any more than to say that I'm both aware, incorporating, and discussing that in this work, but it doesn't change that blackness remains the currency through which these other social identities and formations are channeled through, and how power and resources are redistributed in society.
I think it's my turn.
Hey, Bakari.
How you doing, brother?
All right.
I have a question and a comment. The comment is, I think it was interesting you followed this trajectory from E. Franklin Frazier through the Future of the Race, skipping over Nathan Hare's book, The Black Anglo-Saxons.
Yeah.
And I think that that leans into me to what Dr. West is saying, as well as the Jack and Jill brother who I think left.
I'm recording, by the way, so it doesn't look, I'm not being dismissive of your comments. Yeah.
Okay. And so what I wonder is, as you take this deep examination of this black middle class or black elite, whatever you want to call it, where is the measure of the politics and the ideology? And I think that's really the strength of what Tommy Shelby's book that you talked about. I can't remember the title.
We Who Are Black.
We Who Are Black, right. I think
or
that's
dark. We Who Are Dark.
We Who Are Dark, right.
Yeah.
I think that's really the strength of that text is it takes up a question of what are the politics, what is the ideology, and how do you measure it? And I think that to just kind of talk broadly about people who are channeling through these institutions without any sense of how do we really measure their politics outside of the mainstream American electoral politics system, to me, I think that will be a gap in really kind of measuring what's happening with these people. And I think the brother from Morehouse, I think that's kind of, to me, where he's leaning in. Just kind of curious, like, is there a way to measure this? Is it important, and how would you do it?
Yeah. So I mean, so a lot of that work. This is why I name-checked Tommy, because I wanted to acknowledge that the work of classification, a kind of taxonomy of black ideology, has really driven a lot of the work, including my own grad advisor, David Levering Lewis, who wrote the 2 volumes on Du Bois. Even though it was biographical in its narrative and analytical approach, it was a distillation of the full range of ideas that Du Bois encountered in his journey, amongst both in his own head and amongst others. So I'm not trying to reproduce that right now, because essentially that is on its own terms a project. I'm trying to learn from that work and trying to say that even if we took the diversity of perspectives of black nationalism, of black Marxism, of black conservatism, split those up into 40 different branches for each one, we still have to wrestle with a simpler problem, which is to say that most black people and I've, again, tried to keep elite in a very broad sense, but people who other white elites come to try to understand why black folks are so angry, why there's so many in prison, why they can't learn. These are not questions that dissertate on the taxonomies of black nationalism. They usually distill to, unfortunately, kind of 3 perspectives. One is that the black poor are undeserving of any sympathy. They need to get their act together, which is the one that I gave you, the 0.01%. I'm not interested right now in relabeling that. In the 1980s, it would have been conservative. Today, it would be neoliberal. I'm not sure what it's going to be after Trump is out of office. It could resurge. It could go away. The second is that we need to do more redistribution of opportunity, of education, so on and so forth. This would be the liberal view. The third, which is less popular, would be that I don't expect black people, I'm sorry, I don't expect white people to do very much for black people, and so I'm doing as best I can within my own community, even to a white person. You know, kind of recognition of irredeemable white supremacy means that black people have to turn inward. And so while I work here, that's fine, well and good, but my real work is back in the community doing X, Y, and Z. Now, those three broad examples communicate different things to a white power structure or an elite counterpart. And what I am saying is that the dominant response has consistently been that we've done what we could in terms of legislative change. Now black people have to do for themselves. And they meant that to be the liberal perspective on a kind of, I believe in black people and opportunity, but this is mostly a function of their choices. This is the personal responsibility interpretation of this. And what I'm trying to suggest is that you can't have it both ways. A white elite person can't accept, and I'm not talking about conservatives and people on the right. I'm saying the average folks who run corporate America, who may support a Trump here and there, but generally are not associated with the extreme right. The Republican Party is, I don't want to get in the weeds of this, but the Republican Party is not what it was even 10 years ago. So if you take as a given that corporate America has the capacity to be an agent of some form of good, redistributive good, either in opportunity structures or leaning into change, like Google's Black History Month Super Bowl ad, for example. Or the fact that in Atlanta, it was the business community that kept Atlanta from becoming a Birmingham. That it's those spaces of exchange between black elite and white elite that, in light of the last 50 years, suggest to me that there's been too much agreement that there isn't a structural racism problem in America. There isn't a white supremacy problem in America. That's why I kept bringing up the broken black bodies problem. And to me, that's not a problem that turns on further categorization of different strains of black ideology. That's kind of recognizing that there's only so many ways that you are going to express resistance in these positions of power to tell white folks, no, I am not going to be here at Wells Fargo and participate in credit schemes when it comes to black bankers. Like, that's a choice. I mean, literally, it's a choice. It's not an abstraction. In all of these environments, not always at the top, but most certainly somewhere in the food chain, is a black person where someone's making a decision that is harmful to the black community. And so to me, I don't know what we label that. I'm not even sure that there is, beyond what I've started to do, which I admit is a start, if there is an intellectual or ideological tradition that can account for that. Because most of the 20th century writing has been imagining the damage of segregation and the possibility of integration, and then an assessment of what integration or desegregation didn't deliver, with still the hope that more black firsts and seconds and women of color in positions of power would solve the problem. And here we are. So that's not to dismiss the need for that work. I am suggesting that I'm leaning on that work in order to focus in this other way, if that makes sense. And if it doesn't, let me know, because I won't get this right.
Yes, a marvelous speech. I really enjoyed, and especially also the question answer session clarified a lot of my questions. But I was thinking all along as I was listening to you and conversation about Fanon, about Tagore, his notion of universal identity, and in that relation also critique of Papaya's universalism, and and Sri Aurobindo. So I was wondering, I mean, recommendation of the book is like Humanitarian Identity, Political Sublime, Intervention of a Post-Colonial Feminist, or Negotiating Capability and Diaspora, Philosophical Politics, also Amartya Sen's Theory of Capability. So as you can see, I was very happy to hear this question here of other races, And so what do you think of, you mentioned, yes, we need to be aggressive. I mean, if you're too passive, you're not going to go anywhere. But where do you strike the balance? I mean, I'm not saying they have to, spirituality is needed. Maybe it's the best way to express it as philosophical politics. But, or could politics can merge, join hand with some kind of real ethics, if not spirituality? So if I would like to hear, what are your thoughts on that? I know Dr. West, Race Matters, and everywhere he talks about it, and great admirer, but it was very nice to listen to you as well.
So I thank you. I hope I got those titles, and I'll make sure if I don't, I'll follow up. So part of this is a tension between the kind of what I would call real politique of black leadership. And by that I mean people get up and go to work every day in civil society, and the micro experiences that they have amount to macro consequences. That's the lane I'm trying to pursue here, which will fail to satisfy all of the philosophical and intellectual questions that can be raised by making such a pragmatic claim. At the end of the day, all of us are vulnerable to decision making. I mean, here we are at Harvard. We're in the midst of this, ridiculous Lorgia situation over tenure, and aside from it making absolutely no sense, there's no accountability whatsoever. And so, where does our complicity begin and end? I don't know. But it seems like we shouldn't be here. And so there's a tension for me between knowing enough about the Afro-pessimist traditions, for example, of which you're, I think, playing with in the question. I just read and blurred Frank Wilderson's book on Afro-pessimism, and his position is that we are the way in which other people gain their humanity. Hard stop. And so that poses all sorts of leadership crises, including maybe the elite have it right. If in the end there's nothing, if there's only darkness, why not enjoy the ride? Or as Don King said, the best I can do for poor black people is not be one of them. That is a very dystopic view, but it's one that can be argued and defended, but it's not one that any one of us can take to the bank in terms of getting up and going to work every day. So that's the tension for me between sort of facing the darkness through Fanon or anyone else as clearly and as bravely as possible, the catastrophe of death. I mean, Cornell has spent his entire career helping us to recover traditions of both acknowledging the catastrophe of death and then living in joy and resiliency and beauty in spite of it. But I would say, and this may be overly crass and glib, but Cornell is not guiding most of the black leadership class anymore.
That's a fact.
Yes. So he's still teaching, we're getting smarter, but they're getting dumber. I don't know what other word to put on it. And so there's a gap. And part of what I'm trying to figure out is, where is that gap? Have we talked ourselves into very small academic spaces that no one's listening? Maybe, in some ways. Are we being actively marginalized by corporatist universities like our own that both celebrate our presence and deny the significance of what we actually do? Absolutely. And is that abetted by a handful of very successful black people who we all know in this room are the ones who are whispering in the ears of their white colleagues on boards of corporations or anything else, saying, don't divest of fossil fuels, don't worry about that whole prison thing? I'm on a couple boards. I'm telling you this in part because I've seen this work. And so I'm trying to, with this work and the traditions that are represented by the people in this room, and Skip from afar and anyone else whose work has been evoked in this space, as well as the work of others who I've not yet encountered, trying to apply some of this knowledge in ways that might actually change behavior. But, you know, it's difficult work. Yeah. Thank you. Last question. He's been.
Well, thank you for this lecture. My name is Ian Rowe. I run a network of public charter schools in New York City, in the heart of the South Bronx and Lower East Side of Manhattan. We've got more than 2,000 students, almost exclusively Black and Hispanic, almost exclusively low-income kids. And the kids we serve, the kids we educate, are in communities that are inundated with messages of how structural barriers around race, poverty, class will impede their ability to be successful. But our parents send their kids to our school to show them that that does not have to be the inevitable outcome for their lives, right? So I come to this with what's the orientation for what we teach the next generation about how they can succeed in this country. So for example, there's a ton of data out there that says that if you follow a certain series of decisions, finish high school degree, work, marriage, then children, have a faith commitment, your likelihood of being in poverty is almost nil, right? So we make that a huge part of the broad-based curriculum that we teach our kids so that they don't feel that they're doomed to fall prey to all of these structural barriers that we're so focused on. How do you, when you think of curriculum, how important, because this is part of our history too, the success, the resiliency, the fact that there is this Black middle class that has adopted certain bourgeoisie norms that have turned out to be successful, at least for a component of our community. Where's the balance for focusing on that as well?
Yeah. So this, I appreciate the question because I think this is the hardest question to answer. And by that I mean, I would say we already have over-indexed for the Black middle class success story. I mean, I'm beginning to do research on what's called racial socialization, which in child development literature means how Black children and white children are taught about the meaning of race and racism in America. And so it is true that Black children are often taught how to survive a racist society by anticipating X, Y, and Z. They are often, and even more so, taught that if they do X, Y, and Z, they're going to be successful. That's why the Harvard Business School Rules of Success is meant to be a signifier of a way of communicating through mentorship and motivational speaking that essentially, if you play by the rules, America will reward you for it. The only way that we can reconcile the facts of inequality and disparity and structural racism with that message, which is an Obama era and not long ago message, I'm not interested in blaming everything on Trump, is to then say, well, the Black people who weren't making it, something's wrong with them. And the missing ingredient in most education, I don't know anything about your charter school or the network that it's a part of, the vast majority of public education experiences, and I can only speak for the places I've worked in, Indiana University and Harvard, do not teach political education. They do not teach people how to change government. They do not teach people how to actually have a productive critique, which means the kind of work you choose to do is a work that will change the system. Going to Wall Street is not going to change the system. It might put money in your pocket that, like Robert Smith, you can then redistribute. Nothing wrong with that, unless you give it away on terms that reinforce the wisdom of the system, which is the problem of philanthropy more generally. I'm not blaming Robert Smith for it, but that is a problem in and of itself. Quick side note, 20% of all philanthropy goes to structural change. 80% goes to reinforcing capitalism, essentially saying if the system works, see, we're giving our money away, love capitalists. So there's a real opportunity to take the high road. There's a real opportunity to go back to the traditions of Septima Clark, to go back to the traditions of Ella Baker, to take Barbara Ransby and Kathy Cohen's work happening right now and say, this is what a quality education, not just for black children, but for white children, for Asian children, for Latinx children, for indigenous children means in America today. This is not the radical leftovers and artifact or legacy of the Black Power era that this small cabal of black feminist anti-racist women get to have in their little elite university, which of course the right has been attacking for the last 40 years, saying don't send your kid to college because they're going to be infected by socialist radical ideas. I mean, when the right is complaining about something, you know you're doing something right. So this is my point. I don't know enough about your school or what it teaches, but my guess for most schools is there's a whole lot more we could be doing with our kids in those schools. And it ain't just about our kids, because no matter how much we fortify our kids with the perfect balance of optimism and realism, they are still encountering a vast universe of majority white population of kids out there, and increasingly honorary white kids of all shapes, sizes, colors of the rainbow, who are going to try to deny their humanity. Thank you.